But my message to those people who have felt unseen for too long, who are carrying the country on their back and feel underappreciated and overworked, Conservatives see you, and Conservatives will fight for you.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre on Friday in a rousing campaign-style speech to party members, which touched on a wide range of issues from foreign policy to separatism, immigration, and national unity, and highlighted his proposed Canadian Sovereignty Act. With me today to dig into the substance of that speech and the message Poilievre's overwhelming victory sends, our Sunday strategy session is here. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. James Moore is a CTV News political analyst and a former Conservative cabinet minister. And Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst and former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody. Very good to see you. We'll start with the number before we get into maybe the substance of the speech. And James, I'll start with you on that. You know, more than 87% among the delegates who were there. What is your view on the greater meaning of that?
I mean, it was overwhelming. If there were two words to describe the weekend for Pierre Poilievre, it was mission accomplished. He went into the weekend, you know, a lot of, media speculating about his future and floor crossers and all that. And he came out of it 87.4%. He looked good, presented well, spoke well. Speech was very well received in the room, and I think beyond, and on the personal side, talking a little bit about his daughter, and which I think, a lot of politicians are reserved to do for good reason because the brutality of social media and all that. So he's a little bit of vulnerability there, but the human side of Pierre and what his family's been through, I think makes him, a more attractive candidate to be prime minister because he's walking a path that a lot of people in the country are on. And I think he comes out of it with a lot of wind in his sails. In a democracy, the majority has rights, and a supermajority has a mandate to move forward. So I think caucus members should align. You'll see that in the next while. And I think the party base has been animated and energized because they see a guy who is up off the floor, who's fighting back, and he seems unthreatened. Body language was good, and I think the party is very much energized coming out of the weekend convention. So I think it was a very good time for Pierre and a very good time for the party.
Scott, what's your read on the number?
Pretty similar. I mean, this question on people's minds, I think, going into the weekend is Pierre Poilievre absolutely in control of his party? And the answer is absolutely is. And, that comes even in the face of very discouraging polling numbers, which show that his gap in terms of preferred prime minister remains with Mark Carney. Carney appears to be getting a bump after his travel abroad, the deals in China, the speech in Davos, friction with Trump. And the party says, listen, notwithstanding all that, we are pushing all of our chips in the middle of the table. We are sticking to our cards. We are standing on our bet. And that means no change in strategy, no change in leader, no change in approach. So I thought it was a competent speech. It was an endorsing vote. But the real message of the weekend, and who knows, they might be right. The real message of the weekend was, we think we can do it again and win this time, but we're not changing, that's for sure.
Yeah, I think the tail end of what Scott just said is accurate, and certainly I had the sense that what was really encouraging to people in the room as they listened to Pierre Poilievre's speech was a doubling down on the approach that they've taken before. They are really resistant to this idea that has emerged that there needs to be a significant pivot from a policy perspective or any other perspective in order to be able to win another election. And they were really encouraged, I think, from the conversations that I was able to have, by the fact that convention and that speech seemed to cement the fact that would not happen.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that speech wasn't a pivot at all. It was a reinforcement of all of the messaging that was in the election, and frankly, since his leadership election in 2022. It's his message time and time again. But certainly, Conservatives are feeling happy coming out of this convention. They cleared the bar of Stephen Harper, his 84% to Pierre's 87%. But I want to pick up on one word that James just mentioned, that the caucus should now fall in line. And that's the next question. So, because certainly the people who voted at convention aren't the same voters that are going to vote in the next election. They're a different set altogether. And there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, as Scott just said, to close the gap, the favorability gap between Carney and Poilievre. He's way ahead of Poilievre right now. So how is he going to do that? And who are they going to target? They have to start targeting women. They have to start targeting those 55 plus. And they also have to do work, as James mentioned, on their own caucus, because there's still the Reform Act. He won the vote resoundingly in Calgary this weekend, but he has to convince the caucus to stay with him. And it's still not clear whether those MPs that were considering flirting with the Liberals and moving over aren't still going to do that in the coming months. And I think that's the concern. There's the Reform Act that exists. They could actually still put a leadership test to Poilievre, or it could be a public shaming with more MPs crossing the floor.
Yeah, there were some Liberals who were observing, and certainly James had, reacted to the speech afterward. They seemed pretty enthused by the fact that the Conservatives were doubling down, that the leader of the party was kind of doubling down on their approach. And like it's a rumor factory. They're all like, oh, there could be 4 more this week, et cetera, et cetera. I also did get the chance, though, to speak to Steve Outhouse about some of that, who's managing the next Conservative campaign. He didn't manage the last one. That was Jenny Byrne. He's managing this one. And he did concede, in particular, women, some ridings in Ontario. Like, there were gaps that they had to close. But, again, didn't seem to intimate that, like, a massive policy pivot was in store or personality, change for Mr. Poilievre. He said there'll be a bit more humor, a bit more of himself, which we saw evident in the speech. But it didn't sound like, other than tinkering in those areas, like more was going to be on the table. Do you think that's the right move?
Yeah, well, look, you do strategy. You don't talk about your strategy. If there are slight different emphases that Pierre is going to put forward in the next little while, I think you'll see it, you'll discern it, and you'll know it. There's that. With regard to Liberals in the room, and frankly, Liberals across the country, I don't often actually watch, the daily things that are going on in the House of Commons. But this past week, I did watch Question Period, and I noticed that Liberal cabinet ministers, some of the sort of habitual answers they've gone to, they were kind of snickering. Saying to Pierre in Question Period, we wish you a good number this week. We hope you stick around. We hope you're still the Conservative leader. This week on Parliament Hill will be the unveiling of Stephen Harper's portrait on Parliament Hill in the 20-year anniversary of his ascension and election as Prime Minister of the country. And I remember 2004 and 2005, leading into that campaign and Stephen's election in 2006, there were a lot of Liberals who were saying, I hope Stephen Harper, after you lose in 2004, I hope he sticks around. I hope you guys stay with that guy who doesn't have experience. I hope he's the guy with, that everybody thinks will never win. I hope you stick with. I was having a little bit of flashback to those times when the sort of Liberals who were 20 points ahead in the personal popularity of Paul Martin relative to Stephen Harper and all that, who are pretty self-righteous about the certainty of things to come. And we saw how that ended. And I'm hearing echoes of that right now with Pierre Poilievre and people thinking that this guy can never win. Pierre is the hardest working politician I've ever seen. He's got wind at his back. He's fighting. The party wants him to succeed. And I think Liberals who assume too much today about what's going to happen in the next 3 to 6 months, you're walking down a path that we've seen before.
Do you think they are underestimating Poilievre, Scott? And I would discern a big difference from, the end of Justin Trudeau, where there was not an underestimation of Pierre Poilievre, to now. They're I get told in the past 2 days, one-trick pony. They often use the word I don't mean this, but they're conveying to me loser. Like, there's a lot of dismissing. I think I've put this to you before. I really have noticed it over the past few months.
Yeah, look, only stupid people get cocky. But I want to pick up on what James is saying in the comparison to the 2004-2006 example, because I lived through it. He wants to talk about flashbacks. Well, he just fed me a giant tab of acid, so let's stay there. And here's my recollection, and I think it's really important because I hear Conservatives make the comparison all the time. Well, remember, Harper lost in 2004, rallied, won in 2006. Pierre Poilievre could do the same, but they're following a fundamentally different path. The truth of the matter is that Stephen Harper took stock of his 2004 loss and made adjustments. He made changes. He changed his tone. He changed his approach. He moved people around. He moved policy approach around. And so what we saw this weekend, this kind of death grip dedication to doing the same, is not the Stephen Harper script. So I will be interested to see how it unfolds. And I got to tell you, I remember 2004, 2006. I was there. I was on the front lines. And the reality is that as Harper made those adjustments, we were nervous. We obviously were concerned because we could see that he was attempting to move himself into a more appealing electoral position. I'm not saying that Pierre Poilievre isn't going to be competitive in the next election. I think he is competitive. He's running at 39-40%. But they have decided they will not follow the Stephen Harper script. They have decided they are sticking completely and utterly, unapologetically and unblinkingly with the same course.
Kathleen, last word to you.
Yeah, I think it showed for sure. His speech showed that they're sticking with the same course. I mean, you heard his new campaign manager, Steve Outhouse, say they're going to just double down, bring his authentic self, and as you mentioned, you know, introduce more humor and more family man into it. Is that going to be enough for Canadians who may have actually already cemented their opinion of Pierre Poilievre? I'm not sure. And just to go back to the 2004-2006 example, remember, yes, Stephen Harper pivoted, changed his policy approach, but also the Liberals were mired in scandal and the ad scam that happened that actually really pulled them down in the Calgary report. So it was those two things that led to Stephen Harper being so successful. Right now, you see Carney, in fact, maybe adopting and strengthening his positions by taking up so much of that center space that it's hard for, frankly, any party, New Democrats or the Conservatives, to get the oxygen to break through.
Okay, great points, everyone. Thank you. Thanks for making the time for the conversation today, our Sunday strategy session. Scott Reed, James Moore, and Kathleen Monk.